to define as a community the things that make us a community. Who is Jesus? What does Jesus mean for us as people who call themselves his followers? What does it mean to be a group of followers or a church? What is our role in the world? Today, our song service is going to be slightly different because we were very, very intentional with our choice of songs. We always are. We always put thought into it to try to give the best experience. But today, our songs are going to have a movement and a progression. The first song, Overcomer, talks about Jesus, his work, what he accomplished in the world, the things he did to bring love and justice and to show us those things. The second song, Cornerstone, it speaks to the fact that as people who have seen that story, as people who have looked at Jesus, we then realize that he's crucial, he's important, he's somebody we can build something around, a cornerstone. And then we move into greater things. Because now that we've seen this man, we've made him our cornerstone, we then realize that there's stuff to do. There are actions to take in our city. There are actions to take in our world. There is movement to enter into so that we can bring that same love and justice to the people around us. And then we end with Let Justice Roll. As we go into the world to show people Jesus, let justice roll is somewhat of a battle cry, really, right? We want justice. We demand it for the people who don't have it because of what we've seen in our cornerstone, Jesus. So sing with us these 4 songs.
Lift up your hands. seems to hide its face, I rest on His unchanging grace. When faced with greed and endless war, I look to Him, the cornerstone. I look to Him, the cornerstone. Christ alone, cornerstone. We can make it strong in the Savior's love through the storm. He is Lord, Lord of all. He shall come with trumpet sound, with love and justice as His crown. We'll celebrate His victory and live in never-ending peace. Christ alone, cornerstone. We can make it strong in the Savior's love through the storm. He is Lord, Lord of You're the God of this city. You're the King of these people. You're the Lord of this nation. You're the light in the darkness. You're the hope to the hopeless. You're the peace to the restless. You are. There is no one like our God. There is no one like our God. Greater things have yet to come. Greater things are still to be done in this city. Greater things have yet to come. Greater things are still to be done here. You're the God of this city. You're the King of these people. You're the Lord of this nation. You're the light in the darkness. You're the hope to the hopeless. You're the peace to the restless. You are. to be done here.
If you brought a Bible, go to Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58 if you brought a Bible. Sunday morning, we all come in here, we all sit down, and we all try to forget about, to an extent, how complex life can be. Life is complex when you add up work, commutes, spending money, saving money, bills, and all the other activities that you are responsible for in a given week. But take all that activity and add to it the element of the human relationships that you have. And the complexity of life multiplies by at least 1,000. Because just as complex as me are all of the people that I am related to or connected to in some way. And because of that complexity, and because of the way that relationship works, I owe the people that I'm connected to a certain portion of my life in some sense. I'm indebted to the people that I'm connected to. That's kind of what human relationships and human connectedness is all about. It's certainly on a friendship level is, I'll take care of you, you take care of me, or I've got your back, you've got my back. And some relationships that go deeper, I'd take a bullet for you. And the people that we mutually commit to in this journey called life, or let me put it this way, the more people that we mutually commit to in this journey called life, the greater the complexity that we have to balance. Now, I know this because when I got married, I've said this before, I made this vow to be the greatest husband that the world has ever seen. I found that to be a little more tough than I thought it was going to be. And then, we had a son. And then my life got even more complex because there was this indebtedness not indebtedness that makes marriage sound bad, but you know what I mean. It's a commitment that I had to my wife, and suddenly now two became one, and then there's three of us trying to become one family unit, and how do you make that happen? Then we had a second child. And if you want any clear indication that the more people that you add to your life as far as connectedness or relationship and commitment, the more you have to take time from one and give it to the new one. If you want that verified, just ask Judson how much life has changed for him. He knows as he tugs at your leg and says, top, because he's saying top, meaning lift me up, pick me up, put her down, pick me up. It's just how it is. Like, I can see that there. But then I realize that this complexity goes in every direction because my relationship with my brother has seemed to wane as I've built my family. I don't call my parents as much. I don't stay as connected with my brothers and sisters-in-law like I used to. And then suddenly I find myself not as able to commit as much time and effort to my job. And then there's my friends. Oh, and beyond that, I'm a Christian, which has this ability to connect you in some sense of indebtedness to the people of the world and the needs that exist across humanity. So life is complex enough, but when you add to it the human element, not just going to work, making money, paying the bills, and keeping everything at bay that needs to be kept at bay, because if you don't, someone's going to knock on your door or your car's not going to be in your driveway when you wake up. Going beyond that to the human relationships, life is incredibly complex. The complexity to my life is the paradox of fulfillment and failure. The more I connect with people as a husband, as a father, as a son, a brother, a son-in-law, brother-in-law, friend, employee, and a Jesus follower, the more I find fulfillment in life. But with the more and more connections like that, the more I meet failure. And in a sense, however, whatever word you want to call it, I let people down. That makes sense, though, to me, from like a pragmatic, working, scientific perspective. There's only so much time in a day. And the more and more people that you get committed to, connected to, certainly as you add somebody new to the mix, someone in this span is going to lose a little bit of something. So I don't know about you, but I feel like life is really, really complex. And the more people that I commit to in this Christian way, on top of all of this stuff, the more that it seems impossible to balance life. And as I said, as we dive into this idea of what it means to be a Christian, it's more than I ever thought it was. Like, it's not that it gets easier the more you dive in. The more you dive in, the more you realize that I am my brother's keeper. And so what does that mean? What does my life mean in connection to the world's vulnerable, to the orphan, the widow, the oppressed? What is my life, what is my connection to, even according to Jesus, my relationship and responsibility to my enemies? The path that we've defined for our lives in the last few weeks doesn't make that balancing act simple. So the definitions that we've used, or that we've come up with, or that we've agreed on, or we're adopting, and we've somewhat adopted them, we're continuing to adopt them, the more that we in the breakout sessions can continue to maybe pull a word out, add a word here. But with these definitions, this is what we've come up with thus far. Jesus is the person who initiated a movement that would lead the old humanity out of chaos and injustice into a humanity of justice and peace. That's Jesus. Christians just do what Jesus did. They perpetuate that movement. They take it further. That's what Christians do. Christians do what Jesus did. Then churches mobilize. This is the third definition. Churches mobilize the Christian effort to do what Jesus did. Churches do that with systems and accountability and mutual inspiration. So much so that by coming together, it seems as if the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, Christians will accomplish more together than they can as individuals, and that's what the church is for, multiplying our individual efforts together. And so, add the dynamic of being Christian, those definitions, Christian, and then a commitment to a system that mobilizes and multiplies Christian efforts. Add the dynamic of being a Christian pursuing justice to the other demands in your life, of being a husband or a wife, a father or a mother, a son or a daughter, with in-laws and friends and neighbors or bosses or employees, and life gets complex. So my question for God would be in all of this, how do you balance life with these definitions in mind? With my life as it stands, where there's nothing anti-Christian about it, and then adding into it the elements that we've just described. And so for me, as I think about this question, it's a question that I ask to God every night as I'm falling asleep on my couch at about 8:45 p.m. and going, how on earth did I get here? Like, I have 20 more things to do. Why on earth am I falling asleep at 8:45? I don't care. I'm just going to sleep. And as I think through that, as I'm falling asleep, that's my question for God. How do you balance all of this? And it seems like every time that I'm thinking through this, the answer that I get comes back to one word. One word seems to help me determine how to prioritize and how to balance, because that's really what the word balance is all about. Well, how do I prioritize? The word that comes back to me is not the word holiness, it's not the word pray, it's not dependence, it's not meditation, and it's not believe. The word that comes back is this word justice. Justice, for me, helps me make sense of how to balance all of those relationships that I would have whether I'm a Christian or not. But it would actually speak very well for me to even balance those relationships. But then it begins to make sense of all of it together when you add those definitions of what it means to be involved in a church and committed to that as a Christian, or maybe even not as a Christian, which is what we want to make space for at this church. And so, this word justice. I've used the word justice too much in this series not to make a definition for it, or not to pause and ask the church to consider it and make sure that we agree on what this definition should be and would be. And so if we don't define it, it's so in the middle of all of those other definitions of Jesus, Christian, and church that if we don't define it, we would still be at risk of leaving too much ambiguity and too much room for disunity in our definition of Jesus, Christian, and church. And so the reason that this is so critical is because it is the word that you can use to balance all of the relationships in life. Because here's why. The irony of all of this is, as I was saying, that how do you balance all of this? That's a word that's commonly used in our culture. The interesting thing is a root definition or a root meaning of the word justice is this word balance. Justice often has this idea of distribution or distributive justice. Well, all that means is a distribution of weight in a car is balancing out the weight load of the car. And so these words are very connected. So that, for me, is why it makes so much sense when I'm saying, how do I balance all of this? That this word justice does seem to be the answer for balancing or for prioritizing all of this stuff that I'm connected to in life. Now, the amazing thing about this word justice, as we've said before, and I want to read a couple of verses again to rehash that, is that this word justice best summarizes Christianity. And I was thinking about it today. I've heard people say before, and I liked it as a kid, and then I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And now I like it again, where people will say the Bible is a roadmap for life. I remember one preacher getting up and saying, the Bible's not a roadmap for life. The only maps it has are these. And he opened up to the back of one of those, cheaper Bibles, and there was that's the only map in this book. And what he was saying was this book is about Jesus, or I forget what he went on to say, is that this book is, for me, I got to the point where I didn't like that definition because I'm going the whole Old Testament is just the chronicles of the history of one nation, of Israel. I mean, how is that a roadmap for my life, for my personal life? Because really, in all reality, what I'm finding is this is just God's working with this one nation. And so how do you take that to be a roadmap for life? And in the New Testament, it's just people writing letters to churches that are like beating each other up. So how is this a roadmap for my life? But where it begins to make sense for me again as a roadmap for my life is that threaded through the whole thing is God trying to infuse justice into the world. It was God trying to infuse justice into at least one nation on earth. If all the other nations were going to make injustice their way of life, God devoted his efforts to one nation to begin to build justice into at least one nation so that their way of life could permeate the earth. And when that didn't work, God then put a cornerstone into the world called Jesus, from which he could begin to build out that system, regardless of national borders, regardless of race, regardless of any of that stuff that could permeate the world. And so, let me point out why, first off, justice is the theme of Christianity, and it's the theme of the entire Bible. The Bible is not just, like I said before, the chronicles of Israel's history. That it is, yes, that, but it's God working justice into a nation. And so the way I would do that is from these verses. By the way, you turned to Isaiah 58 when I first got up here. We're going to get there in our fourth selection from the Old Testament. So let me read a couple of passages. And my point in reading this is I'm going from different prophets who existed or lived in different centuries. And through those different centuries, the same problem is being addressed over and over. And it comes back to not building a nation, but building justice. So in Amos 5, 21 through 24, God says, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Like, that's just funny. Like, ooh, that smells. Like, that's what God is saying. Those are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never failing stream. According to God, justice is more of a priority than even worship. Those are strong words. Maybe it was just Amos. Maybe Amos was the heretic prophet, and we really should kick that book out of the Old Testament. So let's check some more to make sure that he's not going rogue on us. Micah 6 through 8 says this, With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Right? In other words, where does salvation come from? What sacrifice is sufficient for me to stand on God's side and not stand against God? And the answer has nothing to do with the sacrifice. This is the answer that Micah comes up with. He says this, He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? Not a sacrifice, just to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Jeremiah 7, 4 through 11. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord. Meaning, this is God's house. This is God's place. And as long as God is in our land being spoken to Israel, then we're safe. Because God, certainly, we're too big to fail, in other words. And God continues, don't trust in those deceptive words because judgment's coming. But he says in verse 5, if you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. Justice. And then Isaiah 58, where I ask you to turn, verses 5 through 7. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed or for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Now, real quick, what is he saying? your brokenness and your being contrite, your humility, that's all nice, but it needs to translate into something is what God is saying. So verse 6, is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. I love that. I'd be like, God, that's not what I understood fasting to be. I thought fasting was about food, and he's like, the fasting of the food is to get you to a point where you'll do this. So it's not fasting necessarily. Fasting is a great conduit. It's a great medium to bring about those things. Because the hope is when you don't have food, you'll think about people who don't have food. And so on and so forth. Or when you're not eating food, it gives you time to really think hard about things other than yourself. And then verse 7, is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter when you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Now, I love stopping there in the Old Testament of Isaiah 58 because that flows perfectly into Matthew 25. And I'm not going to read all of Matthew 25. But in other words, the Bible is about justice. That's the roadmap that the Bible provides. That word is the word that you can use to balance the relationships that you have in your life, the connections that you have, the connections to a wife, to a father, to a brother-in-law, all of those relationships, and beyond to Jesus himself, or in other words, the people that Jesus represents. And that's exactly what Matthew 25 is about. In Matthew 25, Jesus echoes this exact Old Testament idea when it says, is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, and when you see the naked to clothe them? If you remember the parable of Matthew 25, I should have written this down to read, but I'm not, so I'll just speed through it. But mark these verses down, verse 31 through 46. That's the passage in Matthew 25 where Jesus said, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. And he says that to one group of people. Then he says to another group of people, when I was naked, you didn't do anything. When I was hungry, you let me starve. So when you think of Jesus' words in Matthew 25, he is one of the Old Testament prophets. He's one in the same. But he's bringing it to light in a new day, in a new dawning of a new way to build justice into the world. And yes, he has changed it, but it is the same justice that was advocated in the Old Testament. That's Matthew 25. But then Jesus speaks these words. In other words, I just want you to see this everywhere in the New Testament. Matthew 23, verse 23 says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. And I would expect him to say, well, that was dumb. Like, who cares about all that? Amazingly, Jesus says, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law. So he's not completely discrediting what they were doing. But then he says, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law. In other words, you have overemphasized what should be underemphasized. And you have underemphasized what should be emphasized. And he says, you've neglected these weighty matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. In other words, their argument seemed to be, well, we were spending all of our time on these things, and Jesus is going, why would you spend your time on those things when those things don't have the same effect as these more important things? Which, by the way, as we begin to define what justice is, and today in the breakout sessions, what our church should be about in a given calendar year, there are certain things that are more important than other things. Like, he's not saying that there's just a bunch of, there's important, unimportant. No, he's saying there are weights to these things. So continue, where this theme of justice continues in the New Testament. Luke 16 and verse 25, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and this idea of justice. Abraham, speaking here in the parable, is making sense for this person who is woken up in the afterlife in torments. And he says, son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Continuing, won't even go there, but in Acts 2 and Acts 4, we find the church continuing on this idea of justice, doing amongst a church what God had always intended that Israel as a nation would do. And they came up with this idea of this distributive justice that in their church, a pooled group of money would go to meet the needs of the most vulnerable of their church. Then, I'll end it with a later New Testament passage from the book of James. The book of James is very centrally focused on this idea of this Old Testament justice being what it's working out. And James says this in chapter 5. These are just verses we don't talk about enough. Now listen, he begins in verse 1, you rich people, weep and wail. Apparently James wasn't getting rich off the church. You think he might, If James existed today, he'd write a book. And just by writing that book, it'd be a New York Times bestseller, brother of Jesus, right? But he wasn't doing it. But he begins, now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming to you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. Whoa, okay. So does he just hate rich people? Or what is it? Well, he has an answer. It's not just that he doesn't like rich people. This is what he says. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. And then he says this, look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. In other words, they got rich at the expense of other people who became poor. And so very much so, the riches that these rich people have actually belong fairly, justly, to others. So as we consider these Old and New Testament passages, first off, justice is the theme of the Bible. But what is justice is this fifth and final word that we have to define in this series. Biblical justice, for one, is different probably than what you hear the word justice on the news, on Facebook, whatever. And the reason that that's true is because Jesus is typically always different than the culture. Jesus is always different than, what just flows off of people's tongues. Jesus typically hits us in our souls, and in a moment of, oh my, that's when we typically are speaking more alongside of Jesus. And so, two clarifications. Biblical justice is not retributive justice. Retribution justice is typically what we talk about, or what our culture talks about. Retributive justice is demanding that one pay for their sins. It is the day of reckoning. In other words, have you ever heard someone say, justice was served? That's the idea of what, in my opinion, I've always heard justice talked about. It's this idea of retributive justice, that somebody should pay for their sins. It's the day that the consequences of their actions finally catch up with them. And in a very real sense, that is justice. Because the point is, it levels the playing field, right? When you have done wrong, that comes back around to you. And so that does follow into this idea of putting people on equal ground. But biblical justice is not so fixated on retributive justice. Biblical justice is more distributive justice. The difference between retributive justice and distributive justice is the difference between proactive and reactive actions. Retributive justice is a reactive approach to injustice, meaning that when injustice occurs, we will put an end to it, and that's how we ensure peace. Make sense? We'll wait for the injustice to occur. We will send in the guns, the knives, the lethal injections, whatever it may be, and we will put an end to the injustice. That is retributive justice. Distributive justice, however, is a proactive approach to human life, looking out for humanity at every turn and ensuring justice for every human life. In other words, distributive justice seeks to ensure that the injustice doesn't ever happen. Distributive justice seeks to keep peace proactively rather than ensuring peace reactively once the injustice occurs. Biblical justice, in other words, isn't just about punishing the bad guys. Biblical justice is about a way of life. And in the same way that retributive justice seeks to calm the chaos, distributive justice seeks to ensure chaos never ensues. So, a couple of common verses in the New Testament that point toward this idea of distributive approach to justice. 2 weeks ago, we looked at one in John 8. In John 8, Jesus, a just judge, firmly committed to eliminating adultery. 100% pardons, however, a woman caught in adultery with no form of condemnation for her actions whatsoever. I mean, almost acted as if, well, who cares? Why? Because Jesus in that moment refused to condemn a woman of any wrongdoing if the society was choosing to refuse to condemn the man of any wrongdoing. That was this form of distributive justice. That sure, you could make an argument, you could make a case for the destruction that this woman has done, but it would be unjust to do so, given that the man isn't going to have any form of identity in this. Distributive justice distributes justice equally across males and females. James 1:27 says this, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." Christianity, at least the one that I grew up with, seemed to overemphasize the command to keep itself unspotted from the world. We define that in every way possible. And underemphasized the command to look after the orphans and the widows that was just as important in that verse. Then, further, I would argue that there are fads of justice that exist today that focus their efforts to drawing people's attention to the orphans while overlooking the needs of the widows. This is what I mean, I've heard about orphanages all over the world. Like there's these amazing pictures, it's the stereotypical picture, white person, black children, that kind of Christian mission picture, right? Anyhow, I just laughed because there's this great YouTube video, I forget what it's called, and it's probably not appropriate for church, but it's about how like black people view white people on like their mission pictures. It's hilarious, you should see it. But I'll tell you more about that if you want to know about it. But that's why I just laughed and couldn't hold it. And so here's the point, though. It seems to be like this fad, that they're like this justice. We need justice for the orphans. And so we've got these missions that go out and focus on justice for the orphans. But I just don't know when the last time was I saw this incredible campaign to go start assisted living facilities and nursing homes in these third world countries. See, James is saying distributive justice puts a premium on taking care of both the orphans and the widows. And even modern day approaches to justice, I would argue, kind of goes after the more colorful aspects of justice, like a cute kid smiling, clearly hungry, but nonetheless smiling. Like, where is the approach to assisted living facilities and nursing homes for third world countries? I've never heard about it. And in this day of Christianity, distributed justice ensured that there was no overemphasizing even among justice. It was, we will take care of both. So, distributive justice distributes justice equally among all the world's vulnerable, the poor, the orphan, the elderly, the slave, the thirsty, the starving, and the unborn. Matthew 5. You have heard, so we continue to another verse. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Distributive justice distributes justice equally between your neighbors and your enemies. Distributive justice. James 2 begins by saying, my brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, believers must not show favoritism. Verse 2, suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand there, or here, sit on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? According to the New Testament, distributive justice distributes justice equally among the rich and the poor. even if that justice is simply a warm greeting or respect or shared dignity. 1 John 3:17. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Distributive justice, finally here, distributes justice equally between yourself and those in need. In its most simple definition, justice is probably the most well-known verse of the New Testament, and it's actually even well-known outside of the Bible and has no attributed connections to the Bible. In culture, we call it the Golden Rule, but in the Bible, it's Matthew 7:12. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. If the law and the prophets are justice, what Jesus is saying in Matthew 7:12 is that justice is doing to others what you would want them to do for you if you were in their shoes. If you were the elderly, what would you want the young to do for you? If you were the poor, what would you want the rich to do for you? If you were the suppressed gender, what would you want others to do for you? If you were the unborn, what would you want the world of living to do for you? If you were your enemy, what would you wish your enemy knew about you that made you more of a human and less of an animal? If you had needs, what would you want from someone who had less needs to do for you? It's so important to ask these questions because the Lord of justice will one day say, and these words come from Matthew 25, the Lord of justice will one day say, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And the Lord of justice will also say, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Which brings me to my working definition of justice, which is, from the Bible, justice treats every human being and their need as if that person is you or Jesus. If you're not wholeheartedly hyped up about this person named Jesus of Nazareth, then take the definition of it's you. What would you want? If you are a fully committed Christian, then take them both. And that is, what would you want and what would Jesus need or deserve in that situation? And if we do that, we will have no problem distributing justice, dignity, and value equally between the rich and the poor, the male and the female, the black and the white, the young and the old, the intellectual and the simple, the conservative and the liberal, the American and the foreigner, the born and the unborn. And so, last thing I'll say about all of this. With all of the injustice in the world that I just described, let's go back to the original question. Where do we start? Have you ever thought about that? Where do we start? And I think that was the question I was thinking through in the breakout sessions today. If we sit down and we say, well, this is our working definition of justice, and one of the questions I wrote down was, what should we be about then as a church in a calendar year? Where do we start? My proposition to you, once again, using some verses from Scripture, are this. And it'll help us. I don't think it clearly answers the question, but it gives us some guardrails and some guiding direction. Justice starts at home and then spreads into the ends of the earth. So here's the ethic of justice that I think helps us prioritize. My ethic of justice would be this: don't seek to conquer the world's injustice if you can't conquer your own injustice. If you're a jerk to your wife or your kids or your parents or your husband or your brother or your sister, don't believe the lie that you're a champion that you're a champion of justice. While you're out championing for justice globally, your wife, your husband, your kids, or your parents are crying on someone else's shoulder who's trying to bring justice to the injustices that you've created closest to home. And repeatedly, the New Testament calls that approach hypocritical and rejects it as being something other than Christian. This makes sense. If my time, effort, and commitment to this church causes my wife to feel distance from me to the point that she commits adultery because she no longer feels a connection to me, I bear a lot of that guilt. If my son doesn't get the mentorship and the leadership and the fatherhood that he deserves from me, and he grows up and he does some heinous act of injustice that would not have happened had I been in his life more, that's on me. And then someday, some group of people will try to pick up the pieces that were broken because I inappropriately balanced my priorities and my time. And while I was out trying to get justice in the city or justice in the world, I created injustice with my family. And so, for me, the ethic is justice starts at home and then spreads into the ends of the earth. 2 examples. Mark 7 says this. Jesus replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. Okay, what did we just step into, right? This is what's going on. Jesus continued, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own priorities. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that was just like a word, that is meaning it's devoted to God, then that person is no longer required to do anything for their father or mother. Thus, Jesus concludes, you nullified the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And he said, and you do many things like this. Meaning, your system is flawed. You're trying to take money that you know would be almost immediately spent helping your aging parents, and you're trying to spend it the way you want to spend it. Like you want to go out and do something flashy with it, something exciting with it, because you don't believe that helping your aging elderly parents is exciting. And Jesus says, that's dumb, and that's hypocritical, and he rejects it as something other than Christian. See, justice has to mean, according to this, in my opinion, that justice starts at home. And so 1 Timothy 5:8 echoes this. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That makes sense. Justice starts at home. And then the next progression of this is that once you've conquered your own injustice as an individual, and then the injustice that you've been putting into your own family or the people closest to you, then conquer the injustice that exists in your church. Like it's a stair-step, baby-step approach to bringing justice to the world. Where I get that from is Galatians 6:10. That says something that surprises me. Galatians 6:10 says this, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially, I would think, especially to those with the most need, especially to those in third world countries, but that's not what the Bible says. It says, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. See, this justice thing is more guided, I think, biblically than we realize. And I think it's incredibly important when we begin to ask, what are we going to be doing in a given calendar year? That we think through these things, that we think through our definitions of retributive versus distributive justice, as I hope we cling to this definition of distributive justice, and we think through all of the avenues. I hope that we ensure that we're not just going into the flashy, fad form of justice and loving the orphans, but we ensure that we balance that with an approach to help the elderly, whether it's your aging parents or it's somebody that you know. But whether it's flashy or it's not flashy, we figure it out and we do it and we commit to do it no matter what. And even if it feels not fun, it's not as flashy, I hope we do it anyhow. And as we do it, it's important that everybody who commits to doing it together as a church holds the other people in this church accountable to bring justice to your homes before you bring justice into this church. And before you go out anywhere to do justice, you're committed to bringing justice to the church. Because that's where we start, with the household of believers. Justice starts in you. And then it goes to the ends of the earth, treating every human being along the way and their needs as if that person is either you or Jesus himself. Let's pray. God, thank you for, I thank you for the Bible. Because God, without this, I would have already messed up my approach to justice. I would have already left my 2.5-year-old behind. I would have probably already, I hope, God, I wouldn't have done that, but I feel like I would have already done that. And I would have already taken on some martyrdom mentality or some kamikaze mission and said that this is my passion and this is what I do. God, I would have left a wake of injustice in my path. And so, Father, help all of us to zero in on a healthy, pragmatic, and powerful definition of justice that shapes our lives and help us to prioritize between all of the people in the world that we are committed and connected to in some way or another, directly or indirectly, directly in a formal commitment like a marriage or a family, or indirectly through Jesus who calls us to care for the world's vulnerable. Help us to figure out this priority and this balance, and once we figure it out, to do something incredible. Something that lives up to these words that Jesus said, that greater things were coming. And with that, God, may the song that we sang today about justice rolling, God, may that be so true in our families and in this church, among ourselves, before we tackle it in the world, but as soon as possible, so that we can step out these walls and into the world and do incredible things. We look forward to what this year brings us as we conclude this series that seeks to unite us in a common vision so that we might do more and have exponential results to what we could have done individually or what we may have done together without the proper planning and thinking and guiding. And God, may we look back on this year at the end as we head into 2018 and rejoice that we were able to do these incredible acts of justice. I ask these things through Jesus.